Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about Brewmaster Monks in Dragonflight. This is about beta content at level 70. I mainly want to talk about the talents and how the class plays, particularly compared to how it's working right now in Shadowlands. If you'd like a pre-patch guide, I've got that linked in the pinned comment. And as for a Dragonflight guide, that'll be coming out once the release is a lot closer. It wouldn't really make sense to put one out now and then Blizzard scrambles to make a bunch of changes during the final weekend of the beta like they did with Shadowlands and then... Well, anyway. So let's start by going over the differences between level 60 and level 70 Brewmaster Monk. And the differences are relatively minor. The biggest difference I've noticed is that I've gone from having really good gear to having really bad gear. You know, the usual start of an expansion situation. Basically, the Legendary and Covenant abilities you're currently getting from Shadowlands are available in the talent tree, and you just pick those up and then maintain more or less the same playstyle. In the class side of the talent tree, you get some more floating points, a bit more room to customize, and pick up a couple of useful traits, but that half of the tree is mostly pretty fluid and not super impactful on your rotation. Now let's just jump in game and play around in the level 70 talent tree. Alright, here I am in game. I thought I would start off by showing off more or less what my talent trees look like set up at level 60, which they look about something around these lines, I think. At level 60, I actually have the point over here in improved roll, and I'm just not taking bounce back at all right now. But other than that, they look pretty much like this. I am playing Llarold at the moment, so getting Bone Dust Brew and Storm Stout's last keg from Covenant and Legendary, obviously those aren't going to work once you start leveling up. And getting these points is going to be, you know, high priority. So the Mythic Plus build that I've been playing around with looks about like this, basically filling in some of those gaps from the current level 60 build, taking Bone Dust Brew, taking Storm Stout's last keg, putting a couple of points into high tolerance. Frankly, this is kind of one of my biggest concerns with the state of the Brewmaster tree, is that most of the really powerful nodes in the spec tree are things like Bone Dust Brew, Exploding Keg, Weapons of Order, potentially Nizao if you're coming down here and taking Improved Invoke, Nizao, Charred Passions, all these great 1-point offensive talents, Shadowboxing Treads. Excellent offensive impact, really strong, great additions. All of the more defensively oriented talent designs that are like interesting, pretty compelling, are things like Quick Sip. It's not a bad concept, being able to, just by doing your normal rotation, remove staggered damage. The problem is, it's 2 points, and it is, for those 2 points, we'll just take these 2 valuable points out here and put them in here, 2% every time you cast a Spinning Crane Kick, or you get like 5 seconds of shuffle duration when you cast Keg Smash, so you're getting 3% of staggered damage purified. Like, it's not enough. It's undertuned for these being 2-point talents. Again, same down here with high tolerance. You have a couple of points of wiggle room in the tree. Like, this is more or less what a completed non-Nizao tree is going to look like, which obviously leaves you with 2 points. You could put a point in Blackout Combo and a point into Bountiful Brew, but there's a bug with Bountiful Brew. Bountiful Brew is, it was initially implemented as the Llarold Legendary in patch 9.1, found a bug with it on the PTR where it is listed as a 1.5 proc per minute proc rate. So, you know, with Bone Dust Brew's base cooldown being 1 minute, that's really good. I mean, for non-brewmasters, that would have increased the uptime by more than double. But for brewmasters, it would about double your uptime. The problem is, it won't proc while Bone Dust Brew is active, whether it's from a proc or from you manually casting it. This horribly hamstrung its ability to like proc. Like, I would just sit on a dummy and just attack a dummy for a while, just trying to get it to proc, and I could go like multiple minutes. I think I spent about 15 or 20 minutes attacking a dummy, and I was averaging something like a proc every 100 plus seconds. Very bad. Very, very bad value out of this talent. Then it was fixed in patch 9.2 when they made Unity and made it so that everybody who was playing Necrolord was going to have this bonus active all the time. It became capable of proccing over existing Bone Dust Brews, whether they were from, you casting it manually or a proc, and it would extend the duration. So if you had like 5 seconds of Bone Dust Brew up and then you triggered a proc, you'd have 15 seconds. Incredible value. Great legendary. Unfortunately, this version of Bone Dust or Bountiful Brew is the original version, the one that sucks, the one that has terrible uptime, terrible value, can't rock over itself, just not good. Attenuation, on the other hand, seems like a cool concept. I loved this. This was the Necrolord Conduit. I loved it during all of the beta. I thought it was really high value, and they put a cap on it that they hid of 5 procs. So you would get 2.5 whole seconds of cooldown reduction on a 1-minute cooldown. And they realized that that was a problem about a month ago or so, and they buffed the amount of cooldown reduction you could get up to 10 procs. So 5 seconds of cooldown reduction off of a whole Bone Dust Brew. For Brewmaster Monks, the average cooldown on Bone Dust Brew is like 35 to 40 seconds, so you're bringing it down to 30 to 35. It's okay, but it's not great. And I think that the defensive value that you gain out of just going with high tolerance instead of either of these nodes is probably the right move. Certainly for Mythic Plus, where you're going to be taking a lot of damage. Not to mention that you get, somewhere between 5 and 10% haste all the time, which is pretty nice. Even though haste isn't that great, that's a lot of stat budget to get, as opposed to a very small amount of cooldown reduction on Bone Dust Brew or a terrible amount of uptime on Bone Dust Brew. If they fix Bountiful Brew to work like it does currently, which is something that people have asked for, if that happens, then I think this just becomes the obvious go-to, and then your choices are, the world is your oyster. You could come up here and just put 1 point into high tolerance. You could put 1 point into quick sip, drop healing elixir, put that other free point that's in the upper half into quick sip, and there you go. That's sort of the problem I have with quick sip is it's very valuable at super high amounts of stagger. So basically, if you're almost dead, it's great. It's not good when you're not taking insane amounts of damage. Basically the opposite of staggering strikes. Flat stagger reduction is amazing when you're not taking a lot of damage, but a defensive bonus when you're not taking a lot of damage, who cares? I have a couple of other builds I would like to show off as well, but I just want to point out a couple of talents of interest over here in the left tree as well. Bounce Back has been kind of unaffordable at level 60, but it's a great damage reduction effect. At 4 seconds is pretty short, but when you are getting bursted down, 20% damage reduction is pretty significant, and this only being on a 30-second cooldown, that's pretty nice. Compared to most of the other talents down in this area, 4% avoidance, 4% move speed, this Transcendence Transfer PvP thing, like being able to heal more on other people, like this is pretty high value relative to where it's at. Improved Touch of Death is something that I have been actively encouraging people to not use, because the way Touch of Death works is if you have more health than your target and you Touch of Death it instantly dies. With Improved Touch of Death, you can use it whenever an enemy has 15% health or less remaining. It can be a boss or whatever, but then it only does 35% of your max health. So if you use it early, if you use it before it gets into that your health pool window, it'll do 65% less damage. The problem is, Touch of Death is not that well designed of a skill, and the netcode of WoW has some problems. So in Raid, I've had some situations like doing Anduin this week where I know he's about to get into the Touch of Death range. I see his health. It's 400,000, 300,000. I'm just spamming Touch of Death like crazy, and he jumps over it before the ability's ever able to even light up and go off. If I had taken Improved Touch of Death, yeah, I would have gotten only 35% of a Touch of Death if I just used it earlier, but I would have gotten any amount of damage instead of none out of the Todd on him. And also, it allows you to, in that 10th of a second between a priority target going from just in this Improved Touch of Death window to actually being instantly killable, it allows you to not have to wait for the game to recognize and light up. You can just hit it and then it'll do the full kill. I mean, that's like mostly meaningless padding, but it can be useful on high priority targets such as like A-bombs on a fight like Anduin, or just casting mobs in a Mythic Plus that you really want to kill. Improved Roll is a talent that I think I recommended people not take just so they could take Celerity at level 60. It's nice to be able to pick this up, certainly to be able to take Chi Torpedo and have 2 charges of Chi Torpedo. Pretty great. Most of the rest of these talents are relatively locked in. The one that I would point out here is Chi Wave and Chi Burst. Chi Wave is not a great damage dealing ability. Chi Burst really isn't either. The only real value that I see in these 2 abilities anymore, because the rotation is so full over here, especially if you're running Rushing Jadewind, is as a ranged pulling tool, which for Mythic Plus I actually think is pretty valuable. Alternatively, you could just take Detox to be able to like help remove poison and diseases, and in some Mythic Plus that may be a thing of a lot of value, or it may not be useful at all. Race of the Crane, that's pretty optional as well. I think that obviously like taking an interrupt, that's pretty critical. I think that this Celerity and Chi Torpedo, that's very much whichever you prefer, but you definitely want to take one of those. Rising Sun Kick and Fast Feet are a humongous damage increase. They're like 20% more single target damage sustained. It's pretty great. Technically, you could drop Ring of Peace if you don't have anything you need to knock around. Say, for a lot of raid fights, you may not need Ring of Peace at all. You could drop that, and that could take you down to Profound Rebuttal. This is a talent I see a lot of people taking. I don't really think it's very good. 50% more crit healing on Expel Harm. It'll eventually add up to more healing. I mean, I think right now, just to look at my heal or my crit chance, it's like 24%, but then you do get an extra 15% crit chance out of Vigorous Expulsion, so it's like 40%. That it adds up. It means it's going to be like 20% more healing on average from Expel Harm. It also has a tendency to flow kind of into more overhealing. That's probably my biggest issue with it. You could also come down here and take Close to Heart. Then you're having 8% increased healing taken from Grace of the Crane, 8% increased healing taken from Close to Heart, and you're applying that to other people nearby. You kind of have to give up a lot to get that, though. You probably would need to give up Improved Roll and maybe like Hasty Provocation or Ring of Peace to get that. Probably still want to keep Diffuse Magic and Bounce Back. So you could do a tree that's something like this. I don't really want to give up this sort of enemy displacement utility. I mean, Hasty Provocation is like such an iconic component of Monk. It fills me with rage that they took this away from monks at all. But, not took it away, but made it be something that you have to opt into. It's ridiculous. This should just be a baseline component of being a monk. But, at least they didn't actually just remove it. This is an option. This is definitely something that I've seen people playing around with. I prefer a setup that's more like this. All right, now let's take a look at the raid build, and this is sort of the tankier raid setup. It's very similar. You can see I've taken Improved Touch of Death here. I do have Chi Torpedo. I think Chi Torpedo tends to be a little bit more useful in raids, a big burst of movement. I haven't bothered with Chi Wave and Chi Burst at all because they're pretty much only useful for range tagging, like I said, and I just don't think that that really has much value in raid. Maybe there are some situations where you would be forced out of melee range, and then Chi Wave is going to do a little bit of damage, and a little bit of damage is better than just doing nothing while you're running out at range. But there you go. Now over on the right side, Special Delivery I think is an option that you could have run in the Mythic Plus build. I didn't just because I really prefer the feel of Rushing Jadewind, but I think for raid, I think for the smaller target count fights, Rushing Jadewind does wind up being better just because it triggers Resonant Fists so much more frequently. Resonant Fist has a 1 second internal cooldown. It just does AoE damage as a proc. And because Rushing Jadewind is hitting multiple times a second, you're just getting way, way, way more opportunities to trigger Resonant Fists anytime you're running Rushing Jadewind. In all out large scale AoE like you can get in doing large pulls in Mythic Plus, the AoE damage from Special Delivery can potentially add up to enough to be able to compete with the increased number of Resonant Fist procs that you get out of Rushing Jadewind. But for smaller scale AoE, you know, 2 targets, 3 targets, 5, whatever, Rushing Jadewind is better. I think in Mythic Plus, having Healing Elixir is a lot more crucial than it is in Raids. I think in Raids, it's definitely a more optional talent. And in Mythic Plus, being able to have that on-demand self-healing is pretty vital. Now let's take a look at the Raid Nizal build. This is something that I've been tooling around with a little bit lately. I don't really love Nizal. I never liked Nizal even when he was doing tons of damage in Shadowlands. It promotes this degenerate playstyle where, you know, he deals damage based off of the amount of damage that you purify. It is split between all enemies, as you can see there, so it rewards you for taking more damage, but it doesn't do anything based on AoE. But it rewards you for taking damage. So, like, during Jailer progression, I was literally turning my back and sitting down to guarantee that he would crit me so that I could then purify for more. It's just dumb. Like, I did it because we needed the damage for prog. It was the right call in the moment, but it's very stupid to, like, intentionally take more damage. That being said, I do think that this setup of taking Improved Nizal and still taking Bone Dust Brew, Exploding Keg, Weapons of Order with Chi Surge, and then also opting into Counter-Strike so you get a little bit more spinning crane kick damage. I think this is probably the best setup that you're going to be able to put together for maximizing your damage in raids, and specifically single target damage in raids. You do give up some defensive stuff. You give up Healing Elixir to get here. You're obviously giving up High Tolerance to get the extra amount of points to get down here and get Improved Invoke Nizal and still keep Exploding Keg and Chi Surge, but I think this works pretty well. Just to kind of point out, I've already mentioned like Quick Sip and High Tolerance being a little disappointing. I did leave out Anvil and Stave. This was a great talent concept when it was first introduced. 1 second of brew recharge every time you dodge, just to actually read it. Then they put a 3-second internal cooldown on it. It's actually not horrendous in Mythic Plus. Like any AoE situation where you're triggering this basically on cooldown, it's still okay. It is not a gigantic amount of brew recharge, but it's pretty decent. I think it is worth more brew recharge than you're going to average out of High Tolerance. That being said, brew recharge isn't that great of a damage reduction effect. It has pretty significant diminishing returns. You know, you can only purify away so much. You're still taking a lot up front. And because it's a 2-point talent and it doesn't help with pathing at all, like Elusive Footwork gives you a lot more, just more sheer damage reduction with getting more Elusive Brawler stacks. Like, I think that you actually get more value out of Elusive Footwork, even though it's pretty terrible for damage output. It's non-zero, and Anvil and Stave, unless you're taking Special Delivery, Anvil and Stave doesn't give you any damage. I think that going through Anvil and Stave most of the time is probably not the right call. It's kind of surprising they made this a 2-point talent. Same with High Tolerance, same with Quick Sip. These just seem like misses, not because the design is bad. I think the design is fine. The tuning is wrong. This being a 2-point talent, mistake. Pretense of Instability, on the other hand, is a design mistake. This was a pretty great bonus back when it was an artifact weapon power, because it was interacting with Iron Skin Brew and Purifying Brew, and at the time you had to actively maintain a pseudo shuffle by drinking Iron Skin Brew every like 6 or 8 seconds or so. So you were keeping that up all the time, and you also had enough brew charges available back when they were shared between Iron Skin Brew and Purifying Brew to also purify in between some of those Iron Skin Brews. So you're keeping very high uptime on this effect. 10% dodge is a good bonus. If you can maintain like 80% uptime on it, that's great. You're not with this. You're getting like 20% uptime. That's not great. So I think this is probably, just to recap here, I think this is probably the single target max damage build that people are going to run, something along these lines for like farm. I don't think that this is a real prog build. I think that the prog raid build is going to look a lot more like this, unless Blizzard does something to fix Bountiful Brew, make it this sort of 2.0 version that it existed as late in Shadowlands, in which case I think this is a must-have. This boosts your Bone Dust Brew uptime from something like 25-ish% to like 40%, so, or more, 20% to 40%. It's pretty great. And then the Mythic Plus build is very similar. I mean, right now I have the right side identical. And I think that's about it. Now, in terms of how Brewmaster Monk plays, this is a pretty big departure from the playstyle of the past. Brewmasters are crazy offensive now, and I really enjoy their damage output, and the damage profile for that matter. It's extremely bursty, which is not how it's ever really played in the past. I think thematically this transition from a super simple defensive playstyle to a complex offensive approach actually makes sense. I think it's not bad at all. It's new, it's different, but it's actually good, and I think the thematic concepts are pretty cool, and they make sense in the context of being a Brewmaster Monk. It's not just the numbers that are good though, which they are. It's actually a fun playstyle. It's a lot to handle, but once you get the hang of hitting all of the different keybinds, it really flows together very nicely. There's lots of synergy between your abilities. It's a satisfying rotation. That's definitely not something I can say about all of the other tanks. Warrior, Paladin, Druid. Their rotations are fine, but they don't have the same satisfying flow from ability to ability into another ability that the Brewmaster Monk rotation does. The ability to combo together your offensive cooldowns is really nice. Throwing out Bone Dust Brew, using Weapons of Order and getting a couple of stacks rolling, then hitting Exploding Keg to get those extra damage layers added onto your big AoE burst is really great. It feels a bit like I'm playing a DPS, which isn't a way that I've ever felt on Brewmaster Monk, or at least not since Mists of Pandaria, but it's really great. Monk's sustained single target damage is also very high, and that had been a huge weakness for the class for a really long time, so again, this is a big change, but it's a good one. Just in terms of like impact in tanking and raids, even if you were absolutely pumping out of your mind, doing tons of damage on a Brewmaster Monk for most of Shadowlands, the biggest chunk of your damage would come from Nizhao, so you could genuinely be doing great damage and lose threat to the other tank because your damage output from your character was just so low. Most of the criticism I've heard about Monk is from people who are concerned about the lack of self-healing, especially coming off of seasons 3 and 4 of Shadowlands, where Keg Smash, thanks to the tier set, did enormous amounts of self-healing. I think that's going to be a concern for newer players to the class, but here's the thing. Brewmaster Monk has more self-healing in Dragonflight than it did at the start of Shadowlands, or during all of BFA, or Legion or Warlords of Draenor, and all of those expansions were ones where Brewmaster Monk was, at least at some point, but usually for most of it, very well regarded. It has the least self-healing of any tank. It kind of always has. It's also the easiest tank to heal due to Celestial Fortune and Stagger. It has the smallest actual health pool when you compare them side by side, but the largest effective health pool by a mile. It's still extremely strong at dealing with burst damage mechanics and raids. I would argue Monk is the best tank in the game at that, because Warriors can't necessarily block everything, whereas Monk has Stagger, Celestial Brew, Diffuse Magic, Dampen Harms, and Meditation Fortifying Brew, etc. Its biggest weakness is just living through super high DPS and high level Mythic Plus, particularly in the form of magic damage over time. That is a concern. Brewmaster also takes less damage now than it has in the past. It has Diffuse Magic and Dampen Harm at the same time, both amazing defensive cooldowns. It has much higher natural dodge chance in AoE than usual due to shadowboxing treads. And if you choose to use fluidity of motion in pure single target, your dodge chance goes way up there as well because you have so many more blackout kicks going out, generating more mastery stacks. So I feel I've already answered one of my key questions that I wanted to get to here, but I'll just say it out loud just to do it. Is Brewmaster Monk good? Yes, absolutely, it's great. I give it a 9. It's super fun, it's still one of the best raid tanks. In Mythic Plus, I think it's basically in the same spot that it usually is at the start of expansions. Being able to do lots of self-healing as a tank is very useful in Mythic Plus. Not the most important thing, but definitely part of the math equation that makes you good. If you don't have self-healing, or a lot of it, which Brewmasters don't, you need something else to compensate for it. We've seen other tanks throughout the history of Mythic Plus existing that were able to make up for not having great self-healing. Warriors throughout BFA had amazing damage and damage mitigation, and it looks like that's the same situation they're going to be in going into Dragonflight. Druids at the beginning of Season 3 of Shadowlands had preposterous amounts of damage until their tier set got nerfed into the ground. They were great for a little while, but their self-healing wasn't. Brewmaster Monk has good damage output, really competitive among tanks, but not enough to swing the balance of Mythic Plus. So it's probably going to be a middle-of-the-road tank in Mythic Plus, at least as things stand now. Amazing for quick, clear, relatively low-level Mythic Plus runs, you know, weekly keys, or even 20s once the season is well underway and everyone's pretty well geared. For early pushing and for high key pushing late into the season, if things stay as they are right now, it's probably going to struggle purely because it takes a lot of damage and requires a lot of healing to survive, and it has to get most of that healing from other players. Expel Harm just isn't Death Strike. I'm extremely excited to play Brewmaster Monk in Dragonflight. I think this is one of the most fun versions of the spec that has ever existed in WoW. It combines tons of great powers from the class's history into a really strong, diverse toolkit. The limited self-healing is a weakness, and maybe Blizzard will do something about that. It would help the spec's viability in high-level Mythic Plus, but that is really the only outright weakness that the class has. The complexity of managing all of the rotational skills, as well as offensive and defensive cooldowns, is a bigger issue in my opinion than the limited self-healing. They could just tune up the healing component of Expel Harm or Gift of the Ox, and that self-healing issue goes away. The complexity isn't really fixable without nerfing or removing all of the awesome new talents, and I wouldn't want them to do that. Brewmaster is a really strong tank once you get the hang of it. There are some growing pains along the way, but the struggle is worth it, because it's really fun, and it makes you feel like you're better at the game more than just about any other tank. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.